All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Constitution 101 for, oh my gosh, we are just so excited to have Gregory Weiner with us today. He is going to be our special guest. I do want to recognize that this is probably, I think, the 9th Constitution 101 we've held virtually since last summer. So this has been such a great opportunity for us to reach Constitution fans from around the country, and it's just a delight to be able to host you all every month. So an official greeting from Montpelier. My name is Emily Voss. I'm the Director of Education at the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution. And for Montpelier's part, this is a great opportunity to be able to dive into some specific constitutional issues and to really dig into how that is affecting our sort of day-to-day experience and day-to-day life. So, we're not just interested in the historical elements of the Constitution, but the modern ramifications as well. So I'd like to officially introduce our author this evening. Our guest is Gregory Weiner. He is the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Assumption University. He's an expert in the political thought of the American founding. He's a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and he holds a PhD in government from Georgetown University. He is the author of 4 books: Madison's Metronome, The Constitution, Majority Rule, and the Tempo of American Politics, which will be most of our focus this evening. He's also written American Burke, The Uncommon Liberalism of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, The Political Constitution, The Case Against Judicial Supremacy, and Old Whigs, Burke, Lincoln, and the Politics of Prudence. He's published and lectured around the country on such topics as the political thought of our guy, James Madison. And he has published regularly in the New York Times and in the Washington Post. So you may be familiar with his books, but you may also be familiar with all of these frequent publications in the Times and the Post as well. So we are just thrilled this evening to host Greg Weiner. And I just want to remind everyone who might be new, the best way for you to interact with us during the course of this seminar is to use the chat function. We recommend not using raise hand. That tends to be really confusing. So if you have a question, please go ahead and feel free to post it in the chat box as things proceed. And Dr. Weiner will be stopping periodically to take questions from the audience. And so we'll be taking those questions straight from the chat box. So please feel free to post those there. Post early, post often. We would love to have this as much of a conversation as we can get it. All right, so with that, thank you so much, Dr. Weiner. We're thrilled that you're able to join us, and please take it away.
Thank you, Emily. Thanks so much for having me. The work of the Robert H. Smith Center is so profoundly important for the public and for scholars, and I have enjoyed Montpelier's hospitality many times, and it's a wonderful place that does wonderful work. So it's a privilege to be with you. What I am going to do this evening is try to split things into roughly 2 sections. I'm going to go over the thesis of the book with you, pause for questions, and then get into what some of the institutional and contemporary implications of thinking about Madison this way would be. So I am going to share my screen, I hope. I'm not a huge fan of, can you see that, Emily? All right, I'm not a huge PowerPoint fan, but I do want to take a careful look at some texts of Madison's, and I think this will help. So when Madison was a child, he kept we call it what was called a commonplace book, which was a book where he recorded lessons he was learning and aphorisms that struck him and so forth. And these are one of these that I'm going to show you in just a minute is particularly pertinent. I do want to mention another, and I could not find my picture of it, but I'm sure many of you have been to Montpelier. I hope all of you will be. But if you look on the wall in Madison's bedroom, there is a little engraving that in French says, "Reason always is and should be the slave of the passions." And And that says a lot about Madison's democratic thought and what we're going to see here. And it was not new for him. This is about 1763. What Madison wrote was this is from the memoirs of Cardinal de Retz, who was a 17th century Archbishop of Paris, a little bit of a political agitator. And Madison writes, he writes down, I should say, our passions are like torrents which may be diverted but not obstructed. Time is the sovereign physician of our passions and gains its ends chiefly by supplying our imaginations with other and new affairs, wearing out the old by new impressions. Now, what's interesting here is this part right here, our passions are like torrents which may be diverted but not obstructed. That's Madison. The rest is de Retz, but this is Madison circa roughly 12 years old. That metaphor says so much about about his the way that he approaches politics, which is to say, when he says our passions cannot be obstructed, but they can be diverted, and we're going to see how that cashes out as we proceed through his thoughts. So one of the big questions in Madison scholarship, I would say over the last century, I think it's a little bit more settled now, is whether is the extent of his commitment to majority rule, that is, as opposed to, maybe Gordon Wood would say, as opposed to a more aristocratic approach. But in the legal scholarship now, there's also debate about about the extent of his commitment to individual rights. And what I'm going to try to address that, partly by suggesting that is a confused way of posing the question. So what I'm going to outline for you is an approach that I call, for understanding Madison, that I call temporal republicanism. And the idea is whether a majority should prevail at any given point depends on how long it has cohered. So for Madison, the question is not whether majorities rule, it is when majorities rule. And we'll see that as we proceed. So here are the basics. There are no acceptable alternatives to majority rule. We'll see Madison say this, and he says this over and over again. He never contemplates alternatives to majority rule, either whether they are possible or whether they are desirable. For Madison, majority rule is something like the law of gravity, that in a Republican society, majorities always get their way sooner or later. And that in many ways is the glue that holds his democratic thought together. At the same time, he has a lifelong concern about impulsive behavior in politics, about impulsive decisions, about the public getting swept up in passions and so on and so forth. So when he's describing majorities that he wishes, that he thinks are unhealthy, he calls them things like precipitate, overheated, hasty, impetuous, and so on and so forth. And crucially, we'll see this too in some of the passages, a majority that is impulsive is likely to make decisions that do not accord with its own interest. So the solution is to harness the innate power of time to dissipate the passions. The important thing to understand here is that time itself is the point for Madison. Institutions do matter, but the main function institutions serve is not blocking majority rule, but rather delaying and seasoning majority rule. So when Madison praises majorities, he calls them things like cool, deliberate, settled. He says that they are focused on the permanent rather than the transient interests of the community, and so on and so forth. So that's the sense in which the Constitution acts as a metronome for Republican politics. Sometimes that speed is appropriately allegro, so often it's andante. But the point is that the majority prevails when it has cohered long enough for its passion to have dissipated. Now, from this perspective, and we'll see this when we get into the question of individual rights, it's wrong to complain, as we often do, about obstructions to majority rule at any one point in time. We tend to complain, for example, that the Senate, to whose composition Madison was bitterly opposed, we tend to think of the Senate as an obstructive institution. There's some senses in which that can be true, but for Madison, the point is not any one moment in time. It's not a snapshot in time. It's more of a time-elapsed photograph. Now, This dimension of Madison's thought is obscured if we think like this. We tend to think of liberalism, meaning a respect for individual rights, as one end of a spectrum, and republicanism, meaning a commitment to majority rule, is the other. And that's how we typically see Madison, and we think of him as trying to balance those two, right? The key thing to understand at this point is that those are actually different issues altogether. That republicanism or majority rule is a mechanism for making decisions, and liberalism or individual rights is a criterion for evaluating decisions. So let's look at where Madison is on the scale of making decisions. Aristotle famously says that decisions can be made by the one, the few, or the many. And evaluating decisions, they can be either illiberal or liberal. And Madison is unquestionably, with respect to how to make the decisions, in favor of majority rule. I would go so far as to say that I'm not aware of a single time that Madison endorses any mechanism for making decisions other than majority rule. In fact, he calls majority rule the vital principle of our free constitution. And it's interesting that some of the passages in which Madison says this most clearly are ones we tend to read as saying the opposite, saying that he's concerned about majority rule. So I want to take a look at one of those. This is from the 1786 Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments. It dealt with a bill that Patrick Henry was pushing to subsidize what were called teachers of the Christian religion. And here's what Madison says. He says, "True it is that no other rule exists by which any state by which any question which may divide a society can be ultimately determined by the will of the majority. But it is also true that the majority may trespass on the rights of the minority." Now, when we read that, we tend to focus in on the second half, right? That the majority is trespassing on the rights of the majority. But what Madison is telling us is that both those things can be true at the same time, right? It can be true that a majority is trespassing on the rights of the minority. That doesn't prove that the majority is not entitled to prevail. In fact, majority rule is so clearly the case for him. And I want to show you another example. This is Madison writing in the 1820s on the Missouri Compromise. But Madison thought his views on enslavement are complicated, or I would actually argue not terribly complicated. But Madison thinks the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional because you cannot admit states on grounds that make them unequal, with conditions that make them unequal to other states. Now, he says it's unconstitutional. He argues against it. He's retired at this point, of course. But notice how striking this is. He says, "What is to control Congress when backed and even pushed on by a majority of their constituents, as was the case in the late contest relative to Missouri?" That's the Missouri Compromise. And notice this, when backed and even pushed by a majority of their constituents. That's what in Federalist 10 he calls the problem of faction. And this is a clear case for Madison of factious behavior, but he says nothing within the pale of the Constitution but sound arguments and conciliatory expostulations addressed both to Congress and to their constituents. In other words, Madison's point is that a minority that is being, a political minority that is being abused by a majority has no ultimate recourse other than appealing to the majority itself, right? Now, that presents a problem because Madison also says in Federalist 10 that the majority can't be a judge in its own cause. But that is a sort of circle that needs to be squared. I was going to say it the other way around. And the reason for that is Madison also says in Federalist 10 that they inevitably, right, majorities inevitably prevail. So the question then is, if majorities always prevail, and majorities have a tendency to be abusive, both of which he says in this passage, don't we have a problem, right? Don't we have, in fact, a fairly fundamental problem about in our regime? And the answer is, for Madison, is no. He's actually quite serene about this, and that brings us to a puzzle. Madison is concerned about impulsive majorities, right? Persistent majorities always prevail, but impulsive majorities will not, he is quite confident, prevail in the United States. So how does he do that? The answer is that impulsive majorities by their nature are not persistent. Why is that? Because the psychology on which Madison operates it draws a fairly strict dichotomy between reason and passion. That's one of the reasons that I think that is the influence of David Hume on Madison is a little bit overstated. Healthy decisions are the ones made on the basis of reason, and unhealthy ones are the ones made on the basis of passion. And when you look at Madison's writings, that when he actually criticizes majorities, it is almost to a case that involves Madison saying that they are inflamed by passion, right? So, and we see this throughout. Let me just say that he says, the passions, therefore, not the reason of the public, would sit at judgment. Warmth and passion should be excluded, he says, from politics. He refers to the impulse of sudden and violent, he often says, describing passions, sudden violent passions. And as the opposite of that, he refers to the cool dictates of reason. That idea of heat and coolness operates across his thought. Now, what we get here as a solution is that time dissipates passion. So if a majority is getting ready to do something that is dumb, as majorities can be wont to do, the idea is to defer that decision until they have calmed down. That may sound condescending. We'll see that I think it is actually not. So this is 1788. Jefferson is excuse me, complaining to Madison that there's no Bill of Rights in the Constitution, and he says we should have another convention to sort that out. Madison knows how precarious the first one was, but notice why he says it's not necessary now. He says it might be appropriate as soon as time shall have somewhat corrected the feverish state of the public mind, and trial have pointed its attention to the true defects of the system. Now, this part about trial pointing its attention to the true defects of the system, that simply means that that we need some experience to know what's wrong. But this is quite striking. As soon as time shall have somewhat corrected the feverish state of the public mind. Notice that it is time all by itself that does that, right? He doesn't say as soon as statesmen have corrected the feverish state of the public mind. He doesn't say as soon as Congress has. He doesn't say as soon as the Supreme Court has. He doesn't refer to any institutions at all here. Time itself can do that work. He says this also in a letter to Lafayette near the end of his life. Lafayette is returned to America. And he says that a government like ours has so many safety valves giving vent to overheated passions that it carries within itself a relief against the infirmities from which the best of human institutions cannot be exempt. So in just a minute, I want to pause for questions, but then, so actually, let's do that now. I'm going to pause for questions, and then we'll return to how those safety valves work.
Sure, and folks, just a reminder, please go ahead and post your questions in the chat. I wanted to ask a quick question. You mentioned that Madison was opposed to the Senate in the manner in which it ultimately presented itself in the Constitution. What would have been Madison's preference?
Yeah, so this is very interesting. Madison is a political realist. He compromises pretty readily, but he was ready to walk out of the Constitutional Convention over the equality of state representation at the Senate. He thought that the membership of the Senate should be apportioned according to the population of the states. He called the equality of states confessedly unjust. And interestingly, when he gets to the Federalist, right, the Federalist is an apologia for the whole Constitution. Madison, Hamilton, to a lesser extent, Jay, routinely in the Federalist defend things that they said at the convention they disagreed with. This one, Madison does not. He just says in Federalist 62, I think it is, This just sort of, don't try to understand this. This is just a raw political compromise. He says it more nicely than that, but he says this is a compromise. So it's superfluous to try it by the standard of theory.
Okay. That's kind of interesting, and I'm sure you'll get into that later, because it often does seem like the Senate is that point at which action slows.
Yeah. Yeah, we will get into that because there's a reason for that, and it's not the reason we tend to think.
And then just a point of clarification then with regards to the Missouri Compromise. So you think in Madison's estimation that was that one of those examples of an inflamed passion and then perhaps factious behavior taken too quickly?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure too quickly is how he would put it with the case of the Missouri Compromise, but he unquestionably describes this as a passion, unquestionably. Not as a passion, as a faction, rather. So the way that he describes the Missouri Compromise bears all the sort of stigmata of faction. It is an interested majority pushing around what he takes to be a political minority and so forth.
Okay. Pam asks, in Madison's original thought about the Senate, how would that end up being different from the House if both of them had been apportioned by population?
Yeah, that's great. So we'll get into this in more detail, but the key for Madison is the 6-year terms.
Okay.
Right? It's actually not the equality of state representation. It's not, to some extent, it may be the culture of the institution that has developed. But one of the interesting things about the recent debates about the filibuster, which I don't know, strong feelings about. I think on the whole, I'm not sure that a 50-50 Senate is exactly the time to make a major institutional reform. But it's not a Madisonian device at all. Madison wanted the Senate to be essentially majoritarian in character. What he thought distinguished it was the length of time that senators had to serve, so that they could take an unpopular position, have time for passions to dissipate, and then before their terms were up and they were up for re-election at that time by the state legislatures.
Okay. And that actually brings up another point. So, assuming that all the founders here have had experience in state assemblies or previous colonial assemblies, is this a problem Madison felt like he was fixing, or was this a new thing that was presenting itself that had not previously existed?
Yeah, that's a great question. You mean passion and factious behavior. So Madison wrote in 86, 87, something like that, a memo called April 1787, I'm sorry, Vices of the Political System of the United States. And it was his diagnosis of everything that was wrong with the Articles of Confederation. And interestingly, by the way, that's another document that we remember for its criticism of majorities. But the fact is, virtually all the complaints have to do with the fact that national majorities can't do what they need to do. What he does notice, and I think I would say this is somewhat new. I would want to defer to a historian on this, but somewhat new in that period under the Articles of Confederation. It's the way majorities treat things is it's sort of like your 21st birthday, right? People have known to have new freedoms that they fulfill to excess, and there really is a problem. I mean, there are cases of mobs descending on legislatures saying you're going to do this right this moment. There are cases of legislatures passing things one thing and then repealing them the next. Madison tells one wonderful story about serving in the Virginia House of Delegates, or Burgesses, I think it was called then. And the House got swept up in whatever the passion of the moment was, passed something, and then the leaders ran over to the Senate chamber and said, "You got to stop this." Right. So I do think there was, I'm not sure it was wholly unique, but there certainly is a newfound freedom that he's worried gets abused.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for clearing that up. Okay, so Mark asks, relative to the Missouri Compromise, would Madison have been considered biased because he was a slave owner?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this at Montpelier.
You're allowed to
Uh,
say pretty much whatever at Montpelier.
okay. I don't think Madison was that sophisticated of a thinker on enslavement. I just
I
don't. I
think
mean,
that's
there are sort of contortions we sometimes go through to get them off the hook on enslavement, and I just I think great historical figures tend to have great virtues and great sins, and I think you have that has to be weighed in the balance. I think if there were anything exculpatory, and it's not really, it would be that I think he would have been biased less by um, his personal ownership of people than by the balance of power between the northern and the southern state. So I would say it's less as a plantation owner than as a someone from one of the large southern states.
That does make sense. All right, thank you. And Pam, I think we'll probably end up getting to your question. She has a sort of carry-on question from earlier about how the length of service would make a difference in the Senate versus in the House with regards to how it protects minority rights versus majority action. So I think that we'll probably end up getting to that in the
Sure.
following section. So why don't you go ahead and carry on? And, folks, again, please go ahead and keep those questions coming.
Okay, let me get back to well, that is, in fact, I think the first thing I'm going to talk about, because remember that Madison has told Lafayette that there are these safety valves. And the Senate, I think, is the most important of them for Madison. Now, in terms of the question that was just asked, how would it serve as a safety valve? And we'll see this in the text in more detail in just a moment. But the answer is, if you believe, as Madison does, that passions are inherently fleeting, then giving elected representatives, not representatives in the House, but elected representatives more time to resist the public will should allow passion to dissipate before it's able to take hold. So let me, and we do tend to think of the Senate as partly, I think, because of the way senators have learned to talk about the Senate as being different from the House because it protects the rights of political minorities. Now, what that really means, frankly, is that it protects the rights of the minority in the Senate, right? It's that in other words, a simple majority in the Senate can't run roughshod over a relatively narrow minority. But the fact is, those protections are already built into the structure of the Senate by giving small states the same number of votes as large states. The large states, and I don't hold me to this because I'm going on memory, but I did look it up recently. Representatives of the most populous states, those senators, excuse me, let me try to get this right. The 50 Democratic senators, whether you like their politics or not, and I agree with some and disagree with others, represent 9 million more Americans, I think is the number, than do Republican senators, even though the chamber is 50-50. So that protection, and I would argue, by the way, that the fact that there seem to be real geographic differences, not only in interests, but in political views. If you look at a map after a presidential election, you see that whole ribbon of red up the middle of the country and the concentration of blue votes on the coast. I think there's, I think the original plan of the Senate has been borne out in that sense, that the country would not be able to hold together if the more populous states were simply able to dictate to the less populous states. That's also true, I think, of the filibuster, right? The filibuster may or may not be a good idea And as I said, I'm not sure this is the time to get rid of it, if getting rid of it is a good idea. But what defines the Senate for Madison is the 6-year terms, right? So I want to look at something from Federal 63. Is the cool and deliberate sense of the community ought in all governments and actually will in all free governments ultimately prevail over the views of its rulers. Now, I want to note just before I proceed 2 things. One is that the sense of the community ought to prevail, right? And remember, it's the deliberate sense of the community, not the transient or immediate sense, but it ought to prevail and actually will, right? So even if you wanted to inhibit majority rule, it would be again like trying to inhibit gravity. That is just the front part of that sentence is Madison's attitude toward majority rule in a nutshell. It's the only just way of making decisions, and whether you like it or not, majorities are eventually going to prevail. Now, notice in that regard, they're going ultimately to prevail. That would be as opposed to immediately prevailing. So picking up right here, so there are particular moments in public affairs when the people, stimulated by some irregular passion or some illicit advantage or misled by the artful misrepresentations of interested men, may call for measures which they themselves will afterwards be the most ready to lament and condemn. So let's just take a notice of a couple things. One is that these are particular moments when people are stimulated by some irregular passion, right? What does that tell you? That tells you that normally, for Madison, the normal case, the baseline case, is the public has it together, right? So that this is, he says in Federalist 55 that you could not, you couldn't support popular government if you didn't have a baseline assumption of virtue in the people. Notice also his point of reference. These interested majorities who do things that impulsively, they're the ones who lament and condemn, right? He's interested in protecting majorities in that sense from themselves. So this passage paints Madison as anti-majoritarian only if we take out that whole first part in which he endorses majority will. All right, now he continues in Federal 63. In these critical moments, how salutary will be the interference of some temperate and respectable body of citizens, that's the Senate, in order to check the misguided career and to suspend the blow mediated by the people against themselves until reason, justice, and truth can regain their authority over the public mind. Now, notice this is where we see time at work, because what senators need to do is not to say, if somebody comes to them with an ill-advised request or opinion on legislation or whatever else, they don't need to say, I'm not interested in what you have to say. I'm your senator. I'm going to do what I think is best. All they need to say is take a breath, right? Take a breath, and the time itself will work things out, right? There's something else that's striking about this passage, which is this word regain. Reason, justice, and truth can regain their authority over the public mind. What does that imply about the public mind? That ordinarily reason, justice, and truth are in fact in charge. So this is not someone who is, I would say, intrinsically suspicious in some way of majority rule. This is someone who has a deep respect for the people, and who wants to arrange things such that the people can make the best decisions for themselves. Notice again, as I indicated before, that time in and of itself does this work. So that Charles Beard was not as in vogue as he was maybe 20, 30 years ago. But the famous progressive historian said that the Constitution was intended to impede popular majorities. Woodrow Wilson said this as well. It was a common theme of the early progressive movement. That's not Madison. right? That Madison doesn't put institutional barriers in front of majorities. Another way of thinking about this is he puts speed bumps, but not roadblocks, right? Because a roadblock would be futile. There would be there'd be no point. People would simply crash through it, as we'll see. He says that about, in fact, about the Bill of Rights. All right, so that's the Senate. Another safety valve is distance. Right. So we're all familiar with Madison's argument for an extended republic. That's in Federalist 10. And how he shows in that essay that the natural conditions of an extensive republic in and of themselves, right? He makes no reference to even to the Constitution in that essay, no reference to institutions. The natural conditions of extensiveness will in and of themselves defeat the problem of faction. And here's what he says. He says, extend the sphere, meaning the size of the country, and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. Now, this, just before we continue, this is where he's saying the less probable, meaning there's going to be a lot of different interests. It's unlikely that they're going to, it's going to be harder for them to gang up because there won't be one overriding interest. Madison explained this by saying that the reason that there's no established religion in America is not because of the First Amendment. It's because there are so many religions that none could possibly get a majority. But notice that he does not say there won't be unjust majorities. He says, if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison, right? They cannot discover their own strength, right? Now that's a bit curious, right? Because it's not, it implies they can't communicate with each other. Now, there are in Madison's correspondence, in his published correspondence, there's something, Emily might be able to help me out here. There used to be 30 volumes, and now there's some wonderful volumes of his retirement correspondence coming out. So it's now something like 33 volumes of published correspondence with everybody from the deep South up through Vermont and Maine and so on and so forth, right? People can communicate with each other. Madison communicated with people all over the country. So this only works if we supply another assumption, which is it's not that you can't communicate, it's that you cannot communicate quickly, right? And in the time it takes to communicate in a large republic is long, and the life expectancy of factions is intrinsically short, right? So that's how distance works. There's another one that's the separation of powers, and I want to be, let me just back up and offer a disclaimer here first. The purpose of the separation of powers is not to impede or even to slow down majorities, right? It serves another purpose in Madison's thought, which is the prevention of tyranny, as Montesquieu understood it. But it has another effect, which is to say that requiring the concurrence of three branches of government that, as Madison often emphasized, are chosen on different timelines and on different rhythms, requires a longer and longer majority the more serious an issue is. So for a routine, non-controversial matter of legislation, where renaming a post office, for example, right? There's no barrier that stands in the way. The House of Representatives can pass that, the Senate can pass it, the president can sign it without any difficulty. If you go on the other extreme and say something that presents a real fundamental constitutional question, right? You've got a House that's elected on 2-year terms, a Senate that's elected on 6-year terms, not all at the same time, presidents who are elected for 4-year terms, so you have a variety of rhythms there, and then a Supreme Court that is chosen for life, or more specifically for good behavior. So something that posed a real fundamental question for the regime would take some time to resolve. And Madison deals with this when he deals with the National Bank. So in the 1790s, as a member of the first House of Representatives, or the early House of Representatives, I should say, Madison argues vociferously that a national bank is unconstitutional. He notes that the Constitutional Convention, in fact, explicitly considered this and explicitly rejected it. But when he's president, he says, well, he basically says, I'm waiving my constitutional objections. You'll see that here. This is this is what I call a living constitution with a slow metabolism, right? Because Madison says, this is 1815. The veto is 1815, yeah. He says that further disputation over the constitutionality of a bank was, quote, precluded in my judgment by repeated recognitions under varied circumstances of the validity of such an institution in acts of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of the government, accompanied by indications, in different modes of a concurrence of the general will of the nation. In other words, the effect of separation of powers is to allow changes to take hold, but only slowly, right? And what Madison here is saying is, he insists on this in his correspondence, I'm not changing my mind on the constitutionality of the national bank. I'm saying I cannot, as one individual, substitute my belief for the repeated view of the people. So let me go into some contemporary implications of looking at Madison in this way. The most important, I think, and the hardest one to shake is a politics of instant gratification. So we're all familiar with complaints of gridlock and delay, and Congress takes too long, or the president can't get things done, and so on and so forth. That's a perpetual American complaint. That's been around since the founding. But there has been, I would say, an acceleration of it, and I want to give you one example of that. So this is a headline from 2 weeks ago or so, it looks like, on the eve of Biden's 100 days. Now, this is from CNN, I think. Now, I wrote something for the Times about this, actually, I think it was last week. You can argue about whether Biden faced a monumental crisis when he came into office. That's a legitimate argument. But the 100-day standard comes to us, it actually comes from Napoleon. The Saint Jour is what the French call the 100-day interval from his escape from Elba to his defeat and the return of Louis XVIII to Paris. You would think those sorts of origins would have discouraged us from using it to describe our presidents. But it comes in the American political consciousness from Franklin Roosevelt. And Roosevelt, as I'm sure you know, calls a special session of Congress to implement the New Deal, and that's roughly 100 days. And Roosevelt later in a fireside chat refers to it as the 100 days. Since then, we have measured every president, including, this is my favorite part, including presidents in their second terms who were elected precisely because we liked the way that things already were, by how much change they institute in their first 100 days. You can't, one exercise I use with my students is this. I say we're going to have 3 presidential candidates, and we're going to take a straw poll. Candidate number 1 wants to be the national security president and expand the armed forces and so forth. Candidate number 2 wants to be the education president and forgive student loans and so on and so forth. And candidate 3 says, well, I'm good. I'm good here. I'll just, I'm going to show up. I'm going to execute the law. Problems arise. I'm going to deal with them, and so on and so forth. In all the years I've been using that exercise, candidate 3 has not won a straw poll. Partly because these are college students, and if you waive student loan forgiveness in front of them, it's a bit of a distraction. So it's not quite a clean experiment. But the point is, we never see presidents running for office on what they don't want to do, right? It's always a matter of change. And what that first 100 days standard does is what I call this formula for presidential success, which is success equals change divided by time. The more you change and the shorter amount of time in which you do it, the more successful you are considered to be. Now, we do something similar to this with Congress, which is to say that we have measures, we see them in the media from time to time of legislative productivity. Legislative productivity means passing laws. How many laws have you passed? The problem with that and with this standard for presidential success is it takes no account of whether the times call for change, call for a lot of laws, or not. Now, those of you who know your Madison, as I'm sure everyone here does, will know that Madison thought we had too many laws, right? So many laws that ordinary people couldn't keep up with them. So these incentives to do as much as possible, as quickly as possible, I would argue are really in a very stark tension with the Madisonian system. When we refer to, when historians do rankings of presidents, and I ask students for this too, right? Who are the great presidents? Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt, right? It's those three are always at the top. Then you get a little bit of disagreement here and there, but they're the crisis presidents, right? They're always the crisis president. And then you ask who are the worst presidents, and those are the presidents who mishandled crisis. That's Buchanan. Some people say Hoover, and so on and so forth. Poor George H.W. Bush, who was the last president, whether you liked him or not, to talk about prudence and judgment, the importance of judgment and leadership, will never make the top of the rankings where he's famous. He won't even get the ignominy of being at the bottom, right? Because prudence, if you can pick your president who just sort of governed, they could be Bush, you could say Clinton, you could say Coolidge, right? They're just lost in the middle, right? These poor guys, because we don't tend to recognize that in our political calculation. Now, another implication of Madison's democratic thought is what I call the iron law of compounding disappointment. And here's it's sort of a way of saying how that cynicism feeds on itself, right? So on Madisonian grounds, let me just show you how this works, right? Government does something you don't like. So what do? You get ticked off, right? You get ticked off, so you just disengage. And when you disengage, what happens? Government makes more adverse decisions, and the cycle kind of continues. I think we see this in a lot of ways in our politics. On Madisonian grounds, when things don't go your way, you need to re-engage. Right? You need to engage. We'll see, even in cases of individual rights, you need to persuade your fellow citizens. And what we have a real tendency to do is assume some sort of corruption or systemic failure, and it becomes an excuse for disengagement, for cynicism, and it becomes mutually reinforcing. And I would say one result of that is a real atrophy of the skills of civic engagement. That by skills of civic engagement, I don't simply mean writing letters to your member of Congress. I had a sordid career in politics before I went into academia, and my very first job in politics was in a Senate mailroom. And the guy who hired me, who was actually an academic, said, if you ever want to write a novel, you have to spend, which I didn't, but you have to spend a year in a congressional mailroom, because you will see the vile underbelly of human existence, right? The way that people, because it's anonymous, right? It's the way that people talk to their and this is well, I don't want to say how many years ago. This was it was a while ago. The way that people talk to their members of Congress is sort of like the example I give students of have you ever yelled at a referee at a football game? Oh yeah, yeah. Would you do that if the person was sitting across from you at the dinner table? Now, of course, I'm in New England, so they say it depends on what the call was. But the fact is, we treat people differently in anonymous and in face-to-face interaction. So when you're reading congressional mail, you read the most vile things that people say to their elected representatives, and you read enough of these, you start to think, you know, in my daily experience of life, there are not this many mean people out there, right? There's something about it that just brings out about the anonymity of it that just brings that out. So when I say our skills of civic engagement have atrophied, I don't mean we need to learn to write more polite letters to members of Congress. I think that would be nice. But what we really need to do is get back in the habit of persuading one another, right? Not of saying what has become sort of the ultimate American entitlement, which is the entitlement to be agreed with. To say, no, it's part of my job as a citizen, if you disagree with me, to either find some compromise or to persuade you that I'm right. And that is the case, I would argue, even with respect to what we tend to think of as Madison's great commitment is the father of the Bill of Rights, which is to individual rights. So, well, my PowerPoint is freezing, and you're going to miss my profundity. So I'm just going to stop sharing. And I'm going to reshare. Can you see that now?
We've got the quantum
right.
constitution.
Quantum constitution. So here's the idea here. You may know, and if there are any physicists on the call, please let me off the hook on this, right? But in quantum constitution, quantum mechanics, you can only describe a particle's location in terms of probabilities. Okay? Madison's view of rights is something like that. The Madisonian system creates greater probabilities over time that rights will be protected, but it can't give you an ironclad guarantee that things are going to be good at any given moment in time. So this is what I was referring to before, is the difference between a snapshot and a time-elapsed photograph. So let me give you one example of this. April 20th, 1800, this poor guy, Thomas Cooper, if you know your history, what's other than the campaign of 1800, but the great controversy of the day is the Sedition Act, the Alien and Sedition Act, but in this case, the Sedition Act. So this guy, Cooper, is convicted of sedition. He's sentenced to 6 months in jail. He serves the sentence. We tend to forget about this. We know that these people were all pardoned by Jefferson, but many of them had it pretty miserable for a while. So he served 6 months in jail in squalid conditions because he published a handbill that was critical of, slanderous of, depending on how you want to look at it, of the Adams administration. Now, on April 20th, 1800, this is a failure of the Madisonian system. Right? Madison should have predicted that this wouldn't happen. What we need to do is look at it over time, because if you look, and I won't go through the details here, but the Sedition Act is passed in July of 1798. It expires. This is one of the controversies about it, but it expires when Jefferson takes office, and Jefferson issues pardons in March 1801. So that interval of nearly 3 years is the time we're looking at. And here's what Madison says about it. In the case of the alien, this is later in life, in the case of the Alien and Sedition laws, which violated the general sense as well as the rights of the states is a separate story. That's a whole other story to tell there. But the usurping experiment was crushed at once. Right, at once, right? So tell that to Thomas Cooper, who 6 months in jail is not a short period of time, and he also says that it was crushed constitutionally, right? Now, If today someone was locked up for printing something critical of the Biden administration or the Trump administration or whomever else, and they went to jail, and we wanted a constitutional remedy, we would think of going to the courts, right? Now, the courts were quite partisan at the time, so you have to take that with a grain of salt. But one of the striking things about the sedition law is that it does not seem to have occurred to anyone to go to the courts to have it declared unconstitutional. When Madison says that it was crushed constitutionally, what he's referring to is the election of 1800, right? And he says that this is the constitutional solution that occurred at once, right? It actually occurred over a period of, as we've seen, of nearly 3 years, right? So what was the constitutional remedy? Going out and persuading people that the sedition law was unconstitutional. In fact, Madison says that the Kentucky resolutions are a different deal, but he says that the Virginia resolutions, which took aim at the Alien and Sedition Act, and in which secessionists or and their predecessors like Calhoun would later, I think, wrongly invoke. Madison said, "Hey, all we were doing was trying to persuade people to that the Alien and Sedition Act should be repealed." Right? And he says, this is in a separate context, but he says, "Nor do I think that Congress, even seconded by the judicial power, so even if judges back up Congress in some violation of rights, can, without some change in the character of the nation, cede in durable," and that is italicized in the original, "durable violations of the rights and authorities of the states." Right? What is Madison acknowledging here? He's acknowledging bad things are going to happen temporarily, right? He's also saying something else that's very important, which is some change in the character of the nation, because it's the character of the nation that is the ultimate guardian of our liberties. I would argue that we've, in some significant ways, lost sight of this. We tend to think, we tend to talk about rights in terms of showstoppers, right, or sort of ways of short-circuiting political conversation. So if Emily and I are having an argument and Emily says, you shouldn't drive 75 miles an hour in a school zone, I say that's my right. And what am I saying? I wouldn't say that, but what am I saying? I'm saying, leave me alone. I don't have to justify myself, right? That's not how Madison sees it. He sees it as those arts of civic engagement as our responsibility to persuade one another. And in fact, when Madison introduces the Bill of Rights, he says, and I love this, he calls it, when he introduces it, he stands up before Congress and says, this isn't going to do anything. But it is, quote, not altogether useless. So I always tell students, if I return a paper to you and says, and the paper says this paper is not altogether useless, it probably was not a ringing endorsement. Right? The reason it's not altogether useless, the reason it's partly useless, is that it is sort of like the whatever the paper is that you call that you hold up in front of the football team that it runs through at the beginning of the game, right? A stampeding majority is not going to stop and say, "Oh, gee, I didn't know the Constitution said not to do that," right? In fact, what Madison warns is that by forbidding government from doing things government is going to do in an emergency, you're simply sort of conditioning people to think that violating the Constitution is okay. And what Madison says about bills of rights in general is that they are least effective when most necessary. Right. So when are bills of rights most necessary? When the people are whipped up into a frenzy. When they're fearful would be one example, such as a time of war. And when are they least effective? They're least effective when people are precisely when people are fearful. So Madison's point here is that when you are asserting your rights, you have a responsibility to persuade. Right? Now, if you're asserting your rights to me, I also have a responsibility to listen and to be reasonable. And one of the sort of glue that holds all this together is that majorities and minorities in American politics, Madison thinks, are always shifting. So I don't really have an interest in kicking you around today because you might be in a position to kick me around tomorrow. This is what Tocqueville would later call self-interest well understood, or rightly understood. But Madison's point is that importance of persuasion. That's true because it is ultimately public opinion is the only meaningful guarantor of rights. It's also true because rights tend to conflict with each other. Right? So they need, the boundaries need to be adjusted according to the public good, and that in Madison's thought is a function of what he calls the Republican principle, by which he means majority rule. There's a case, Supreme Court case I tell students about called Goldman v. Weinberger. And Weinberger was the Secretary of Defense in the Reagan administration. Goldman was a rabbi who was a chaplain in the Air Force. And he wanted to wear the ritual head covering that observant Jews wear. And that violated the uniform regulations, and he was not permitted to wear it, so he sued. The Supreme Court actually turned him away. Interestingly, Scalia and Ginsburg were serving together on the Court of Appeals on this case and disagreed. But what the Supreme Court said was, look, if this is what you want to do, you have to persuade people. And the key, and here I would say there's a real implication for contemporary politics in an age of polarization, is that people have to be reasonable, right? So we tend to think of, well, it seems kind of undignified to force this rabbi to go around and knock on doors and say, gee, is it okay with you if I observe my religion? But the fact is, Congress did amend the Uniform Code of Military Justice to allow religious garb within certain regulations. And in Madisonian terms, that is placing rights on a much more secure foundation, which is the opinion of the people, the settled opinion of the people, than if it was simply a decree of the court. So this is what I call the rights corollary of that law of compounding disappointment, which is when our rights are violated, what do? We retrench by going to the courts. We say, it's not my job to persuade you of my rights. I'm going to retrench. What happens? There's a well-documented effect called the backlash effect, that when controversial issues are taken to the courts, people often end up worse off than they were before because the majority gets upset, right? So when you withdraw from the persuasive process of politics, your rights are actually less secure and are then more apt to get violated. Now, let me note a related fact, and I'll conclude and look forward to your questions in just a moment. That for Madison, this importance of time and these skills of civic engagement are based on what today we would call patience, right? I mean, again, tell that to Cooper sitting in a wretched jail cell. But generally what he means is, if you don't like the way things are, you have to undertake the hard work of persuading people, and that's probably going to take a little while. The key fact to understand, and it's one of the great puzzles, I think, of applying Madisonian thought to the present, is that in Madison's day, patience is not really a choice, right? Things don't happen immediately, even if you want them to, because it takes time to communicate. It takes time to get from Montpelier to Washington, and even over to Monticello, and so on and so forth, right? What we need to understand, and there's a dilemma here, is that patience has gone from being a fact of life to being a virtue. In Madison, as you may remember from Federalist 51, is famously unwilling to rely on virtue to keep the constitutional regime running. This is if angels were to, if men were angels from Federalist 51. Now, he's not hostile to virtue. He assumes a certain amount, but he doesn't want to depend on that to run the whole thing. So I would say this is something we really need to make a concerted effort to this patience to recover. And one reason, and I want to end where we began with Madison's commonplace book when he was 12 years old, is this is another aphorism of Cardinal Duret's, and it's really good, which is why I wish my screen would work. So give me just a minute, sorry. This is Cardinal Duret's again, patience works greater effects than activity, right? It's time itself, again, doing the work. So let me stop there. Emily, I think we have about a little over 20 minutes left. So I'd
We
be
do. Yeah.
delighted to take your questions.
And you've covered a lot in that last section. So some interesting questions with regards to the Senate, hearkening back to kind of that idea of the Senate as safety valve. So we have a question from Barbara that voters don't necessarily want senators to act as safety valves to frustrate voter passions. How have senators over time explained this function to voters? And I guess I would tack on to that, in the Madisonian era, senators are not directly elected. So how does the 17th Amendment change this relationship between senators and those they represent?
Yeah, so in terms of how senators explain this, I think in Madison's terms, it's not really important that they do. In other words, the 6-year term, if you believe passion is going to dissipate, serves that purpose all by itself. So if I knock on my senator's door the day after he or she got elected, and I'm very upset that they didn't agree to this or did agree to that, right? They don't actually, I mean, one hopes they would be polite, but they don't actually have to answer for these 6-year terms to work. They just have to say, thank you for sharing your views. You walk away, and presumably, but within 6 years, you've had time to think things over in Madisonian terms to recover your senses. In terms of the 17th Amendment, there is what Madison would have called, and here's where he does follow Hume, a filtering mechanism. That senators are chosen in a step of remove. Now, there is a school of conservative constitutional thought to which I'm often sympathetic on other issues, but that says this was sort of the fall from grace, was the 17th Amendment. Everything's hunky-dory before then, and one of the things that one of the reasons everything is federalism, I should say, is hunky-dory before that. And one of the reasons for that is if I'm a senator, my job is to represent the state government. So it's going to be that's who I have to answer to, and I'm going to be inclined to protect, to safeguard state authority. Look, the reality is those elections were either notoriously corrupt, right? But payoffs, all those sorts of things that you can imagine going on in 19th century state legislatures. Or, as we know from Lincoln and Douglas, the state legislative election itself becomes a proxy for a senatorial election. So I'm not as keen as many of my friends are on, I mean, added to which it's just never going to happen, to sort of the idea that we could somehow restore the glory days by repealing the 17th Amendment.
All right. So we have some interesting questions with regards to the sort of idea of distance as well. Okay, so kind of at the basic level, does the idea of distance work today? I think that's a great place to start that discussion.
I think that it does not, Madison has an interesting, I think it's in a letter toward the end of his life, the railroads have started to come. And he says, isn't this great? Because it's contracting, it's in effect making the country smaller and able to communicate better and so on and so forth. But of course, if you pay care, and I do think he means that, but if you pay careful attention to Madison's thought, contracting the sphere is not a good thing, right? From the point of view of faction. So I do think that is a problem. I think the answer is to reclaim patience as a virtue, to not expect, it's not simply that we expect our elected representatives to do what we want, it's that we expect them to do it right now. So I think that requires something of us that it did not require in Madison's time.
There's a good follow-on question here from Roy, who asks, do you feel that social media has negated the benefit of a geographically large republic because people can quickly find and communicate with each other? And further, does it tend to delay or limit the benefit of the cooling period?
Yeah, I think I may have to invite my kids in to answer this question, because I don't know that world as well as I should. But I think I think it has a couple of effects. One is social media, I would say, even as opposed to other types of instant communication, certainly deprives us of that distance, of that time that distance provides. But remember that for Madison, passions are inherently fleeting, and I think what social media does, and Donald Trump didn't invent this by any means, but certainly used it, social media, quite a bit for this purpose, is it allows you to continue to sustain passions, right, in a way that Madison can't quite relate to. So I think it's that process of nourishing, constantly rekindling those passions that is a problem. Now, there is a form of constitutional conservatism that it's hard to distinguish from nostalgia. That says, boy, weren't things good? So the same thing as the 17th Amendment argument, and that in itself is not a very Madisonian point of view. Right? Madison very much says you accept the parameters of the society you are dealing with. This goes, it's an insight that goes all the way back to Montesquieu and before him to Aristotle. Madison would not say, the questioner didn't say this, but many people do, would not sit back and say, my Lord, what are we going to do about this social media thing? Madison would call us, I think, to on Madisonian premises to figure out how to work with it, not simply how to regret it.
Yeah, social media has thrown curveballs in so many ways
Yeah.
we had not previously anticipated. Okay, so I have a kind of a further question, because you brought up Federalist 10, and I thought this was kind of interesting, that this idea of extending the sphere would make it difficult for these different factions to discover their own potential collective strength. And I guess I think that's interesting because he's writing prior to the time of political parties. And so do you think he doesn't foresee a time that the idea of coalitions might be a thing?
Well, let me answer that in two ways. I do think he foresees coalitions. He says at the end of Federalist 51, he reprises the argument of Federalist 10, and he says that you'll never get a majority on principles other than justice in the general good. And I think what that implies is the converse too, that if a majority is based on justice in the general good, right? You can put together coalitions, and you won't have any problem sustaining them because they'll be based on reason rather than passion. So I think he's open to that. Now to accept that, to sort of enter Madison's world, you have to accept that there are some majorities that are bad and some that are good. It's not just a matter of respecting everybody's political preferences, right? Yeah, there has to be a morally objective way of looking at politics. The great puzzle of parties, and I think it's one of the I have an answer to it, but I'm not entirely satisfied with it, is that Madison fairly clearly in Federalist 51 assumes that is not counting on parties because he assumes that institutional interests will trump ideological ones. So if I'm a member of Congress, my first loyalty is to the Congress, not to a president, not to loyalty or opposition to a president of my own or the other party. So that I think is hard to. I mean, there are good arguments to be had over this, but I think that is ultimately hard to deny. Well, who's the father, or at least the uncle of the American party system? It's Madison. So there is one way of looking at this. Again, I'm not wholly satisfied with it, but I think it helps. That Madison's views shifted, right? And by the way, nothing wrong with that. I mean, there's my views shift all the time. Madison is certainly smarter than I am, and so this is a whole cottage industry of Madison scholarship, is to render him entirely consistent or to accuse him of being inconsistent. When we forget, this is a guy who was born a subject of George II and died a citizen of Andrew Jackson's Republic. Probably some changes of mind in there somewhere. But one thing on which I think he did change his mind is that when he writes Federalist 10, the great thing that he fears, and he observes it in the states, is in terms of tyrannical or abusive would be a better word, behavior, is majorities acting immediately, using, as he says, the government is simply an instrument of their will, right? By the time he sees Hamilton, and I would say mainly Hamilton, maybe to some extent Adams, but mainly Hamilton, doing things that in Madison's view are unconstitutional and abusive and sort of, if not giveaways to special interests, at least things that invite special interests into government. He thinks that, well, the real threat now is not the abusive majority; it's the abusive regime, and the public opinion has to be mobilized in order to be a check on the abusive regime. I think that does explain the shift, but it really neutralizes the separation of powers, and I would say we're still dealing with that today.
That actually cues up Brian's question here very nicely, because not only in Supreme Court cases, but there's often discussion or reference to original intent. And so with Madison and the other founders and framers as well, naturally changing their opinion over time, how would it be possible for anyone to determine original intent, and like original to what time?
Right. So, I mean, I think the theory of original intent would simply, not simply, but would say original intent at the time the law was ratified. But this is a problem that originalism has been dealing with since, at least since the days of Robert Bork. And part of the problem is, the theoretical problem at its core is, and Madison said this, by the way, because Matt is one of the reasons he kept his notes of the convention secret for so long. It doesn't really matter, Madison would say, what I thought the instrument meant. It's what it meant to the people when they ratified it. So this is what's called original public meaning, public meaning originalism. Scalia was a great champion of this, and it suffers from some of the same problems, right? Because the law can be different things to different people in different state ratifying conventions and so forth. But it somewhat gets around that problem. In terms of time, I do think there's that notion that's kind of latent in Madison of a constitution that can change, but only slowly, the living constitution with the slow metabolism, as I said. But I do think Madison thinks the law has to be authoritative until the law is changed, and I do think it's a problem that we tend to change the law through application or practice or judicial interpretation rather than simply changing
That's a great point. And I was thinking about that when you were referencing the Madisonian preference of change taking time, and the recognition that a certain change might be inflamed by passion right now, but let's wait and see how this plays out. But in the modern era, it really feels like a lot of the cases that the Supreme Court takes are cases based on the Bill of Rights and a lot of personal rights. So I could really see, if I felt like my personal rights were being violated, I wouldn't necessarily want there to be this lengthy period of time that the legislators decide to deal with the issue. Right. So like in some ways, how much time is appropriate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, and what is it reasonable to expect of someone whose rights are being violated? Here's what I would say. For the first, for basically all of the 19th century, the Supreme Court decided almost no cases on the basis of the Bill of Rights. So if that was supposed to be a weapon for the judiciary, as is often said now, based on Madison's speech introducing it, it took him a while to take up the weapon, right? The challenge is this: I can depend on judges for my rights, but if they blow it, I have no recourse, right? And if they blow it, I'm worse off than I was before. So let me give a somewhat controversial example of this, but I think it works regardless of your views on the underlying issue. We used to live. I live near Worcester, Massachusetts now, but we used to live in Arlington, Virginia, and we lived on a cul-de-sac, and it was sort of Norman Rockwell. The kids would come out and play in the cul-de-sac, and the parents would come out and talk, and so forth. And this was mid 1990s, I would guess. There was a constitutional amendment on the ballot in Virginia to define marriage heterosexually. This, by the way, is part of that backlash effect, right? When the courts got involved, the initial reaction, which lasted for about 20 years, was a spate of state constitutional amendments that actually left advocates of same-sex marriage worse off than they had been before. Anyway, so there were some people, some of our neighbors, talking in the street, saying, well, citing religious arguments, and I just don't think I can support same-sex marriage. Well, there was a gay couple who lived at the end of the street, and they went around before Election Day and put a letter in everybody's mailbox, and it said things like, we can't be beneficiaries on each other's life insurance, we can't visit each other in the hospital, so on and so forth. We'd really appreciate it if you would think this over. And the next day, the conversation in the cul-de-sac is, gee, it's a lot harder when you're actually thinking about when there's a human face on it. So the question I would ask is, on which grounds are your rights more secure? Right? Persuading the public to respect them, or persuading a judge to resist the public? If you believe public opinion has overwhelming force in a Republican society, as Madison did, then your best bet, whether it's just or fair or not, is persuading the public.
And that's really interesting. And that was, a very similar example to actually what I was thinking about when I was asking you the question. So yeah, just really, really interesting for us to consider. And I think I'll let Barbara have the last question, just because I think it's so good. So what mechanisms are there for teaching patients, or perhaps persuading others to adopt a more patient approach related to civic engagement?
So I'm going to give you the dorkiest possible answer to this.
We welcome
the cheapest. All right, but it's kind of a cheap. It sounds like a cheap answer, but I really believe it. Which is sometimes I get the question because I'm a critic of excessive reliance on the courts for rights cases, as we've just been discussing.
Mhm.
But that is so ingrained. How could we possibly get people to think about it differently? And my answer is civic education kind of got us into that mess. So it apparently does something, right? So if you talk, by the way, and I know I know Montpelier does sessions for high school teachers, and perhaps some are with us now, right? If you talk to a college student, an interim college student in high school, they've learned about the Bill of Rights. They have not read the main body of the Constitution. Right? You can understand that it's easier to teach. It's holds people's attention better, and so forth. Well, that's a case of civic education having a real intangible impact on how people look at the constitutional regime. And I think if we can get in the habit, if we can get back to civic education, I think that will be important. But I want to put a particular gloss on that, which is to say, I've written a lot about prudence, and somebody asked me a couple of years ago, well, how do you teach prudence? And my answer was, the very worst thing you could do is try to teach prudence, because it's the same thing with patience, right? You can't, I mean, you can't stand in the front of a classroom and tell students, thou shalt be patient, right? Liberal education, in its best and most classical sense, works through what Edmund Burke called the moral imagination, which is the ability to infer moral lessons without being pounded over the head with them. So it might be, it certainly is the case that we need to read the Federalist. It certainly is the case that we need to study the whole Constitution, I hasten to add. It's also the case that you learn those things through literature, through interacting with your peers, through all sorts of other aspects of education that I fear in the rush to turn secondary and even college education into vocational, into career preparation. I fear we are losing those things, but I still believe they have immense power.
Well, thank you for that. And as you say, yes, Montpelier does do programs for both middle and high school teachers. So we're, hopefully able to influence teachers at both the middle school teaching and the high school teaching levels.
Right.
So yes, you certainly have a friendly audience there.
Right.
Well, we are pretty much right up against time. It's just about 6:30 on the East Coast. So thank you all so much for your great questions this evening. And thank you, Dr. Weiner, for all of this really interesting food for thought. I think at least I'm certainly coming away from this, and I hope the audience is too, with a differing level of respect for the what feels like gridlock actually, certainly serving its Madisonian purpose in a lot of ways. So thank you all very much. And we hope that you'll be able to join us next month in June, June 20th. Our theme next month will be Lincoln and the Civil War and the constitutionalism of the Civil War. And our guest then will be Daniel Farber. So we look forward to that. But Dr. Weiner, thank you. And your books, I believe, are all available on Amazon, if not the Montpelier store. So certainly be on the lookout for Madison's Metronome, but then future pieces in the Times and the Post as well. So thank you all very much and have a great rest of your evening. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for having me.